learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Today, we're diving into a really pivotal time in Japanese history, the late 19th century.
Yeah, it's a period where Japan is just working incredibly hard on two fronts, really.
Exactly. Trying to get, equal footing with the Western powers.
And at the same time, getting much more involved in what's happening over in Korea.
So we'll look at how they tackled revising those unequal treaties and also how tensions ramped up over Korea, setting the stage for, well, some major conflicts later on.
Let's start with the treaties. These unequal treaties. What were they exactly, and why were they such a big deal?
Okay, so Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, inherited these agreements, right?
Right, and they had two sort of major drawbacks for Japan. First, no tariff autonomy.
Meaning they couldn't set their own taxes on goods coming into the country.
Precisely. Big economic limitation. And second, extraterritoriality.
Ah, the consular courts thing, where foreigners in Japan weren't under Japanese law.
Exactly. They were tried by their own country's officials under their own laws. So for Japan, wanting to be seen as a modern sovereign nation,
these treaties were a huge obstacle, undermined their authority.
Absolutely. So revising them became like a top national priority. It was about gaining respect, gaining equality.
Makes sense. So how did they first try to tackle this? Were there early attempts?
Oh, yeah. Pretty early on, actually. In 1878, the foreign minister, Terashima Munori, he managed to negotiate a deal with the U.S. to get tariff control back.
Okay, progress.
Well, yes and no, because then the other powers, especially Britain, stepped in.
Ah, they didn't like it.
They blocked it. So that agreement with the U.S. never actually took effect. It showed just how tricky it was going to be dealing with all these different Western interests.
Right, a real roadblock early on. So if direct negotiation hit a snag, what was Plan B? I remember reading something about Westernization.
Yes, the Nyū-Ō, or Westernization policy. The next foreign minister, Nyū-Ō, had this idea.
What was the thinking there?
Basically, Inu believed that if Japan adopted Western customs, Western lifestyles, if it looked more Western,
then the Western powers might be more willing to treat Japan as an equal and revise the treaties.
That was the hope. And the most famous symbol of this was the Rokumaikan.
The big hall in Tokyo with the Western-style dances.
Exactly. Grand balls, government officials, foreign diplomats, all very high profile. A deliberate effort to, showcase Japan's modernization and sophistication.
Sounds quite, dramatic. Did it work? Did the fancy parties actually help?
Well, it was complicated. It definitely got attention, but it also stirred up a lot of debate inside Japan.
How so?
Inouye tried to link this Westernization push to actual treaty negotiations. He proposed opening up Japan's interior for foreigners to live and work.
Oh, okay. UN, right.
Right. Naichisakya. In exchange for getting rid of the consular courts and getting some tariff control back.
But there were strings attached.
Big ones. Things like basing Japanese law on Western models, which was already happening to some extent, but also including foreign judges in Japanese courts for cases involving foreigners.
Wow. Foreign judges in Japanese courts. I can see how that would be controversial.
Extremely. Both inside and outside the government, people saw it as a serious blow to national sovereignty. Damaging.
So the opposition was strong.
Very strong. Negotiations stalled, the whole policy faced backlash, and Inouye ended up resigning in 1887.
So that approach didn't quite pan out either. Japan's really walking a tightrope here, isn't it?
Definitely. Trying to modernize and gain acceptance, but without compromising its own identity and sovereignty.
Okay, so Inouye's out. What's the next attempt? Who takes over?
Commissioner Nobu steps in as foreign minister. He tries a different strategy.
Which was?
Instead of one big negotiation with everyone, he tried negotiating separate treaties, country by country.
A divide-and-conquer approach.
Sort of, and he actually had some success. Signed new treaties with the U.S., Germany, and Russia in 1889.
Okay, this sounds promising again.
It did, but that same sticking point came back, the foreign judges issue.
Still, even in these separate treaties.
Yes. This time, the proposal was to allow foreign judges in the Supreme Court, the Daishinin.
In the Supreme Court? Oh, boy.
Yeah. Domestic opposition exploded again. It got very heated. And tragically, Kuma himself was attacked by a nationalist extremist.
Attacked? Seriously?
Yes. He survived, but was injured. And politically, it meant the end of those negotiations. The treaties he'd signed never put into effect.
Just one setback after another. Were there other attempts around this time?
The next foreign minister, Aoki Shuzu, kept trying, but he faced hurdles too. There was even the Lutsu incident in 1891.
What was that?
A visiting Russian crown prince, the future Tsar Nicholas II, was attacked by Japanese policemen while visiting Utsu.
Oh my goodness, that must have caused a huge diplomatic crisis.
It certainly didn't help treaty negotiations, let's put it that way.
Yep.
It just seemed like Japan couldn't catch a break.
So, after all these failed attempts and setbacks, what finally moved the needle? How did Japan actually achieve treaty revision?
It really came down to a shift in geopolitics, particularly Britain's view of Russia.
Britain and Russia. How did that connect to Japan's treaties?
Well, Britain started getting seriously concerned about Russia's growing power and influence spreading across Asia, especially towards East Asia.
Okay.
And as Japan was modernizing, building up its strength, gaining more international recognition, Britain started to see Japan differently.
As a potential counterweight to Russia, maybe?
Exactly. A strong, modernizing Japan could be useful in balancing Russian ambitions in the region. This made Britain more willing to reconsider the unequal treaty.
Ah, so international strategy played a key role. It wasn't just about Japan proving itself.
Right. It was a confluence of factors. Japan's efforts mattered, but the changing international landscape created the opportunity.
So tell us about the actual breakthrough with Britain.
This happened in 1894. The foreign minister was Mutsu Munemitsu, and working closely with Aoki Shuzu, who was then the minister to the UK.
The same Aoki who tried before?
Yes, persistence paid off. They successfully negotiated the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of Commerce and Navigation.
And this was the big one.
This was huge, a major turning point. It finally abolished consular jurisdiction. Extraterritoriality was gone.
Wow, so foreigners now under Japanese law.
Correct. And it also partially restored Karaif autonomy. Not fully, not immediately. That part would be phased in over 5 years. But it was the critical first step towards full control.
That must have felt like a massive victory after decades of trying.
Immense. A real milestone on the path to being recognized as an equal by the Western powers.
But you said partially restored Karaif autonomy. When did Japan get full control back?
This took a bit longer. The final step came in 1911.
Okay, so nearly 2 decades later.
Yes, under Foreign Minister Komura Jotaro. Through continued diplomacy, Japan finally achieved the complete restoration of its tariff autonomy. That really marked the end of the long struggle over the unequal treaties.
A long and winding road, but they got there. Okay, so while all this intense diplomatic effort on treaties was happening, Japan's focus was also increasing, turning towards Korea, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Korean Peninsula was becoming a central point of tension and ambition for Japan in this same period.
Why Korea specifically?
Well, after Korea opened up to the world, Japan wanted to expand its influence there, kind of get in ahead of other powers.
But there was already another major player interested in Korea, right?
Yes, Qing Dynasty China.
Yeah.
China had historically viewed Korea as a tributary state, part of its sphere of influence.
So you have Japan wanting to increase its influence and China wanting to maintain its traditional dominance. Sounds like a recipe for conflict.
Precisely. A classic rivalry was brewing.
What were some of the early flashpoints? How did this tension play out on the ground?
There were several key incidents. First, the Nyū-Ō incident in 1882.
What happened there?
It was basically a revolt in Korea.
Yeah.
Soldiers, mostly. It actually strengthened the hand of the more conservative faction, the Uju Jidaitu, who were closer to King China. And during the chaos, the Japanese legation in Seoul was attacked.
Not a good sign for Japanese influence.
No. Then, a couple of years later, in 1884, you have the Gapsing coup, or Kushinjian.
Okay, what was that about?
This time it was reformist groups in Korea, the Dakuritsuchu, led by figures like Kim Il-jun. They wanted modernization, reforms, and they looked to Japan for support.
So pro-Japanese reformers.
Essentially, yes. They saw an opportunity because King China was busy fighting the Sino-French War. So with some Japanese backing, they staged a coup in Hansong, present-day Seoul.
Did it succeed?
No. King China, despite being busy elsewhere, intervened quite quickly and forcefully. The coup collapsed. Another setback for the pro-Japanese faction and for Japan's influence.
So tensions are clearly rising. An attack on the legation, a failed coup. How did Japan and China try to manage this? Did they talk?
They did. To sort of calm things down after the Gapsing coup, Japan sent Ito Hirobumi, a major figure, to Tianjin in 1885.
To negotiate with the king.
Yes, he met with Li Hongzhang, his counterpart.
Huh.
They hammered out the Tianjin Treaty, or Tiro Tenjin-jiaku.
What did that treaty say?
The key points were that both Japan and King China agreed to withdraw their troops from Korea.
Okay, a mutual withdrawal.
And they also agreed not to send military advisors there anymore. It was an attempt to, step back and avoid immediate war.
Did it work? Did it ease the rivalry?
Temporarily. Perhaps it prevented an immediate clash.
Yeah.
But the underlying competition, that didn't go away.
Right. The core issue of who held sway in Korea remained.
Exactly. And back in Japan, there were factions pushing for a much tougher stance on Korea. Plus, the Japanese government was seriously investing in building up its navy, partly to counter King China's influence. The rivalry was still simmering, definitely intensifying under the surface.
So the Tianjin Treaty was more like a pause than a resolution. What finally broke that uneasy peace?
The trigger was a major event within Korea itself, the Dongkak Peasant Revolt in 1894.
Peasant Revolt. What was that about?
It was a large-scale uprising against the corruption and autocratic rule of the Korean government, a really significant internal rebellion.
How did that lead to war between Japan and China?
Well, the Korean government couldn't handle the revolt on its own, so they asked King China for help.
And China sent troops.
Yes, they dispatched troops to help suppress the rebellion.
Okay, how did Japan react to that?
Japan saw this as its opening. The government at the time, the Second Ichu cabinet, reacted immediately. They sent their own troops to Korea.
Huh. So both sides sent troops into Korea again, despite the Tianjin Treaty, or maybe using it as justification.
Well, Japan argued King actions changed the situation. And remember, this is 1894. Japan had just secured that crucial treaty revision with Britain.
Right, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty.
So Japan was feeling more confident, perhaps more assertive on the international stage. They took a very firm stance against King China's intervention.
And things escalated quickly from there.
Very quickly. By late July 1894, Japanese and Qing forces were already clashing in Korea. And then in August, Japan formally declared war on King China.
A first Sino-Japanese war had begun.
That's right. Dishin Nishin Sensa.
And how did that war go for Japan? We touched on Japan's modernization earlier.
It was a remarkably swift and decisive victory for Japan. Their modernized military, especially the Navy, proved far superior to Qing forces.
A clear demonstration of the Meiji-era reforms paying off, militarily at least.
Absolutely. The war ended less than a year later, in April 1895, with the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Consiglan de Shimonoseki Juyaku.
Signed in Shimonoseki, Japan.
Yes, at the Shunpanroen. Ito Hirobumi and Mutsu Munemitsu represented Japan, and Li Hongsang represented King China.
What were the main terms of this treaty? What did Japan gain?
The terms were very significant. First, King China had to recognize the full independence and autonomy of Korea, effectively ending China's claim of suzerainty.
Okay, so Korea, formally independent, at least on paper. What else?
China ceded territory to Japan. Lot of territory. The Liaodong Peninsula.
That's in mainland China, right? Strategically important.
Very. Also, the island of Taiwan and the Penghu Islands nearby.
So Japan gained its first actual colonies.
Yes. Plus, China had to pay a huge indemnity, a large sum of money, about 200 million taels, which was roughly 310 million yen back then.
A massive financial gain, too. Any trade concessions?
Yep. Several more Chinese ports were opened up to Japanese trade and industry places like Hangzhou, Suzhou, Chongqing.
Wow. So a comprehensive victory. Japan emerges as the dominant power in East Asia, it seems.
It certainly looked that way. They had territory, money, influence, their first colonies, a real foothold on the Asian continent.
I sense a butt coming. Was it that straightforward? Did everyone just accept this new reality?
Not quite. There was immediate pushback, particularly regarding the Liaodong Peninsula.
Who pushed back?
Russia. Russia had its own ambitions in Manchuria, which is right next to the Liaodong Peninsula. They were not happy about Japan gaining control there.
Okay, so Russia felt threatened.
Deeply. And they weren't alone. Russia got Germany and France to join them in putting pressure on Japan.
Germany and France, why them?
Different motives, but they aligned with Russia on this. Together, these three European powers
Intervened.
Yes. This is known as the Triple Intervention. Sengoku Kanshu. They strongly advised Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China.
Advised. Or demanded.
Pretty much demanded. The implication was clear.
And Japan had just won a war. How did they respond? Could they resist?
Realistically, no. Japan was strong, but taking on Russia, Germany, and France simultaneously, that was impossible.
Because they had to give it back.
Reluctantly, yes.
Yeah.
The Japanese government accepted the demand and returned Liaodong to China, though China had to pay an additional indemnity for it.
How did the Japanese public react to this, giving back territory they'd just won?
Oh, there was widespread outrage. A real sense of humiliation and resentment, especially directed towards Russia, who was seen as the main instigator.
Understandable.
This feeling was captured by the slogan, Gashinstan.
What does that mean?
It literally means something like sleeping on rough wood and licking gall. Basically, enduring hardship and humiliation now for the sake of future revenge.
Wow, that's intense. So the triple intervention left a very bitter taste and fueled anti-Russian sentiment.
Massively. It became a powerful driving force in Japanese popular consciousness and foreign policy moving forward.
It's interesting that Germany was involved in that intervention too. Wasn't Japan looking to Germany as a model for things like its constitution?
Yes, absolutely. Japan borrowed heavily from the Prussian-German model for its constitution, military, legal system, many institutions.
So Germany intervening must have felt like a betrayal.
It certainly didn't help relations. And then there was this other idea gaining traction in Europe around the same time, the Yellow Peril, Kacharon.
The Yellow Peril, what's that?
It was this sort of racist idea, drawing on old European fears of Asian invasions, like the Mongols.
Yeah.
In the late 19th century, it got revived, often directed at China and Japan.
And Germany played a role in promoting this.
The German emperor, Wilhelm II, was actually a big proponent. He famously commissioned a painting depicting it, and often wrote to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, warning about this supposed danger and praising Russia's role in the Triple Intervention as holding back the tide.
So the German emperor is pushing this anti-Asian idea while Germany is intervening against Japan's gains. Did this create anti-German feeling in Japan?
Definitely. Despite the institutional borrowing, the Triple Intervention and Wilhelm II's rhetoric sparked significant anti-German sentiment. There was a German doctor, Erwin Belz, who lived in Japan for ages.
A foreign advisor.
Yes. He wrote an essay after returning to Germany, around 1906, basically saying German attitudes were the main cause of this anti-German feeling in Japan. Apparently, it wasn't published due to political concerns.
Interesting. And just a few years later, Japan and Germany would be on opposite sides in World War I.
8 years later, yes. The seeds of that conflict were sown much earlier. It's fascinating how these relationships shifted. There's even a French cartoon from 1887.
Before the war.
Yes, called The Fisherman's Benefit.
Yeah.
Yafunori.
Yeah.
It shows Japan and China as fishermen trying to catch a fish labeled Korea,
Okay.
while a big bear, representing Russia, is lurking behind them, ready to snatch the fish away. It perfectly illustrates the competing interests over Korea, even back then.
Wow. So looking back at this whole period, it's just packed with change and tension for Japan.
Absolutely, a real whirlwind. That drive to revise the unequal treaties was so fundamental, It was about Japan defining its place as a modern sovereign nation.
And winning that recognition on the world stage.
Exactly. But at the same time, the whole situation with Korea, the rivalry with China, the interventions, the war, it really set the stage for even bigger conflicts down the road.
You can really see how these experiences, both the diplomatic successes and the military clashes, the gains and the setbacks like the triple intervention.
How they profoundly shaped Japan's view of the world and its own ambitions heading into the 20th century.
It makes you think, doesn't it? What if those treaty revisions had happened differently or earlier?
Or what if the relationship with Korea had taken another path without that intense rivalry with China? How might things have unfolded?
Yeah, those counterfactuals are always fascinating. It just highlights what a complex and absolutely crucial period this was for understanding modern Japanese history.